There's a new PBS Frontline documentary that takes a look at what has become known as the baby tourism industry in the U.S. And here's how it works. You have these baby brokers who recruit pregnant women from around the country, and they use the promises of financial help or a fresh start. The documentary says the brokers draw these women away from their home states to places where adoption rules are more permissive and the safeguards are less stringent. And then on the other end, you have these hopeful adoptive parents who are told they can move through what is normally a highly regulated process more quickly. The film says the epicenter of this national adoption marketplace is Utah. The journalist Gabrielle Glaser reports the story, and she tells about a young woman who was already a mother, but who found herself pregnant again in a relationship with a partner she'd become afraid of. Now, she was considering an abortion, but it wasn't an option where she was. So she was desperate, and she needed another solution.
So she went online, considering adoption. She didn't find any local agencies. She thought that was weird. The next thing she knew, she clicked on an ad, called the number, and got connected to this woman in Virginia, unlicensed, simply just runs a business, named Flossie Green, who immediately sold her on the idea of going to Utah. She didn't have to worry about the birth father. She was going to have money for food, clothing, housing. It sounded like a really nice Band-Aid. And so she takes her 2 children with her. She's about 3.5, 4 months along. She's still nauseated. And she found herself landing in Utah very, very late at night and gets picked up by a woman, an agency owner named Denise Garza, and finds herself in this apartment complex in this suburb of Salt Lake. I think it's about 25 miles north, Layton. She spent the duration of her pregnancy almost entirely alone, asking herself throughout the pregnancy, now what? Now what do I do?
As my stomach got bigger and just my emotions were just really getting in the way, like for me. And, you know, at times I felt like I was scared to say, hey, I don't want to do it anymore. Yeah. It's getting to the end and I don't know if I owe something. I just felt pressured all the way around.
As the woman began questioning, wait, do I really want to do this? She would text Denise Garza's agency saying, you know, I'm kind of having second thoughts about this. And there was really no concept of this is a life decision that you are about to undergo, and we're not going to help you through it. We're going to give you money to get through it, but we're not going to help you with the actual decision making. The decision that you made is all but done because you got on a plane and you came here and you are partaking of this system that we have provided for you. So don't ask any more questions.
Well, I just felt trapped, isolated, and I was just ready to run off, and I didn't know where to go. It just feels like I've been hit by a train several times.
So she delivers the baby. And she tells the nurses, I don't want to hold the baby. I don't want to bond with the baby. I'm signing these papers because she's very worried that she might have to pay money back. But she hears her baby crying. She knows it's her baby. And she said, just bring her to me. And once she held the baby, she realized, I can't go through with this. I can't. She goes back to the apartment. She tells the agency owner, no, I'm keeping my baby. There is a big dramatic scene. Police came. She felt very threatened. So she went online to a Facebook group where people were openly talking about these hard choices. She gets up the courage to post something. Immediately, these local birth mothers leap into action, and they go and help her find housing at someone's mom's house, which was where we meet her in the film.
I don't even know what to say no more. I'm sorry. Let's switch.
Trade you. You're like, oh. Okay.
Yeah. I never would have thought I would be in this situation, like, for real. Going back to square one.
We were witnessing the pressure of what the money means when you are 24 hours, 36 hours postpartum. You are not in a position to be making a massive decision, certainly one that you might have second thoughts about. And yet the pressure was right there, not only in the hospital, and the curtness of the messages and the knocking on the door. It was so very clear that these babies were and are a resource that is being tendered on the market.
This is RadioWest. I'm Doug Fabrizio. The Frontline documentary is called Baby Brokers. And this isn't Gabrielle Glaser's first time examining the world of adoption. She's written a book about its darker history, a time when unmarried women were pressured to give up their babies. So she's been reporting on the subject for years, and that's where we began the conversation.
I was a reporter in Central Europe. I was based in Warsaw for The Economist, and I heard a story about people coming to Poland because as communism was ending and the free market was blooming, I heard people casually discussing a market of blonde, blue-eyed babies, and it repulsed me. I couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that there could be a market for babies. And I checked into it, and I ended up writing an investigative story for the New York Times because it was very much an American story. Americans were coming to Poland in big numbers for these blonde, blue-eyed babies. And it was sort of a black market deal through back channels, and you had to know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. And I gumshoed my way to a maternity home that was a convent, and I got thrown out on my ear once it was clear I wasn't searching for a baby and I was a reporter. And it stayed in the back of my mind for a very long time. You know, there's sometimes these stories and you just, even throughout a long career, you go back to them, you circle back to them. I was a reporter in my native Oregon in the early 2000s, and I noticed there was a giant billboard on the way to Seattle that had a price tag for a black little boy of $7,500, wow. A Chinese girl of $25,000, and a white, blue-eyed, blonde little baby girl for $30,000. And I almost drove off the road. Again, there was the market. What I had reported in Warsaw was right there outside Seattle. And I tracked down who had paid to put up that billboard, and it turned out to be a pastor, a former NFL guy. He went by the name of Hutch, and we had a long conversation about this ongoing market in babies. And it really piqued my interest. And that led me to want to cover surrogacy. That led me to want to cover people coming to Oregon for cheaper eggs. And in that reporting, I met a guy who was adopted. And he was getting a kidney donation from a friend. He hoped the story, this was in 2007, he hoped the story would go viral and that his birth mother would see it. And so that's what led to the book that I wrote that came out 5 years ago.
In the book, you use one family's history to examine what historians have called this baby scoop era, when thousands of these unmarried women were pressured or persuaded to surrender their children for adoption. And I wondered, the Frontline documentary that we're talking about today is about what's happening now. But I wonder, what's the connection that you're seeing between the stories you've written about the history of adoption and the moment we're in right now? Is there a connection that you see?
Oh, very much so. Thank you for asking that incredibly poignant question, because the through line remains the same, and it's the market. It's the market. There is a very, very, very fundamental human and biological urge to want to procreate, to want to raise a family, to want to have the experience of continuity. There's nothing more basic. And 100 years ago in our history, this became monetized, commercialized, and commodified by a diabolical social worker in Memphis who stole babies from poor women throughout the Memphis area, realized that she could sell them to prominent people, which she did. Her name was Georgia Tan, and she started a nationwide network of bringing beautiful babies from Depression-era women who were poor, down on their luck in the Mississippi Delta, in Memphis and beyond. And she sold those babies to politicians. She sold them to movie stars. And she was smart enough and connected enough to want to cover her tracks with secrecy laws, which she convinced legislators in a handful of states to do. And that was a shock to me. When we think of adoption, we think of, what a beautiful narrative. This child whose parents can't raise her is welcomed by a family who wants to. And yes, that's very much true. But the decisions behind that are wrenching on the part of the birth families who cannot raise that baby, and certainly in the adoptive families themselves who are welcoming that baby. But also, certainly today, there is a recognition that that origin story begins with rupture, begins with loss.
Let's talk about the Frontline documentary film and get to the scope of the modern adoption industry and, of course, the need that's driving all of this. In the film, you say it has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Give us a sense of what we're talking about here. We're talking about a massive market that's emerged, I guess.
So because we have this patchwork of laws, there is no real federal oversight of adoption. We don't have actual real numbers. We have an estimate of how many potential adoptive families are searching for the numbers of babies who are surrendered each year. We have a pretty decent idea about the fact that there are roughly 25,000 babies surrendered by American-born women in the United States every year. There is one number that suggests there could be 1 million couples looking for those 25 babies. There are other rough estimates that suggest there could be 2 million. So whether we're looking at a ratio of 40-1 or roughly 80-1, I think we worked it out to, it's something like, if it's 1 million, it's something like 43-1, but we don't know. But there are market analyses that show what we do know, which is basically like, okay, the agencies who report, nonprofit agencies who report, not for-profit agencies, nonprofit agencies who report to a lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. called the National Council for Adoption. What the nonprofit agencies have reported, and maybe a smattering of attorneys who are able to conduct adoptions in certain states, not all, but some, we come up with nearly $2 billion. Wow. But that's not even close to what the for-profit industry is bringing in. Some of these nonprofit adoption agencies in Utah, we can see what they spend on advertising. And some of them spend more than $500,000 a year. That's the nonprofit. Is that being included in the $1.8 billion assessment from really serious market analysts? I'm not sure.
Wow. So I want to set up the background for the investigation that you lay out in the Frontline film, there are a lot of states that have some pretty strict laws about adoption. But there's another part of the industry that has developed over the years, and it's the system known as adoption tourism. These are pregnant women you mentioned that are basically they're lured away from home with this promise of quick money. And then for parents, there's a promise of there's an easy and a quick process. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more in a moment. But just explain how it works in basic terms, because you say in the film a lot of this begins online. So just take us to that point where, let's say you're a couple who are struggling to get pregnant, you're considering adoption, or you're a woman who's pregnant considering placing the child for adoption. And naturally, I guess, of course, you're going to go online. So start there. What happens? When you go online, you go to Google something, what do you see?
So if you are a pregnant woman and you go online, you're considering adoption, there are paid ads specifically targeted to you that are tailored for what you might be looking for. If you need financial help for rent, if you have a birth father problem, you go online, you look, and you are expecting to find an agency in your state or maybe, nearby, regional.
Yeah.
But that's not happening because there are these we have this patchwork of state laws with varying degrees of regulation. And Utah, for whatever reason, developed a series of laws that made it especially attractive, both for women who may be seeking and needing financial assistance right then and right there, and for adoptive parents who may be at the end of their rope. Maybe they've spent tens of thousands of dollars on infertility treatments that didn't work. They want to start a family. They're ready. Maybe they had, repeated miscarriages. Many people go online and they realize, oh, this is so complicated. Wow, there are all these 50 state laws. Where do I go? Okay, I'm in Texas, or I'm in Georgia, or I'm in New York. Where do I start? Wait, what? There's a 3-year wait in my state? I don't want to wait 3 years. I want a baby sooner than that. So you turn to people who help shepherd you through the process. Women go online and they get attracted and are targeted to by brokers who seek them, who get a kickback fee for sending them to Utah. Meanwhile, the adoptive parents go online and they hire consultants who say, I'm going to help walk you through this and I'm going to get you a baby more quickly than you could on your own if you were to go through a legacy agency in your state. I'm going to help you achieve your dreams. Well, who doesn't want that? And so online you find glowing reviews from other adoptive parents who say, oh, these people are fantastic. They helped me get a baby in 6 months. It sounds really too good to be true.
And then in Utah, of course, once you sign paperwork, which they do, there's no turning back. And I guess this is one of the reasons why Utah is at the sort of the epicenter of this. It's one of those, as you have been saying, porous states with porous laws. No grace period, no out legally necessarily. If they reconsider, you're in once you sign.
Right. That law has recently been changed. And now there is a 72-hour revocation period for women. But at the time, up until very recently, if you signed termination papers.
Up until just a few months ago, let's say.
Up until March.
Yeah.
Up until March 2026. If you signed a revocation form that renders you a legal stranger from your own baby, there was no turning back. Utah also has a very unusual law, a fraud immunity law. And what it says essentially is even if fraud has been committed, if both parties have deceived one another, but if the agency itself has been deceptive to either the birth mother or the adoptive family, there's no overturning the adoption. That finality made Utah very attractive to a lot of adopted parents as well, because it's very frightening. Once you go through this whole process of embarking on an adoption, the idea that a birth mother might change her mind and decide to want to parent, that's frightening. And that's another thing that has made the law in Utah very, very attractive to people who are eager to start and grow and build their families, who haven't been able to otherwise achieve that.
Gabrielle Glaser, she's the correspondent in the Frontline documentary called Baby Brokers. We'll put a link to it on our website, radiowest.org. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're profiling the latest documentary from the PBS program Frontline. It's a story reported by the journalist Gabrielle Glaser about the baby tourism industry in the U.S. The documentary follows women who say they were recruited to leave their home states and come to places with less restrictive adoption rules. Adoptive parents are on the other side of the market. They're drawn by promises of a faster, more certain path to getting a baby. And this kind of supply and demand has created a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the epicenter is Utah. You were mentioning earlier, you said sort of in passing, and in Utah, for whatever reason, this is like this. But let's drill down a little bit more on whatever it is the reason, because it seems like some of this is kind of circumstantial. There are particular laws, but there's also, we have to talk about a very distinctive religious culture in Utah. And I'm wondering, does that help us understand in any way why it is that Utah is so different from other states, why it is that Utah finds itself as the epicenter? Like, what would it be about this place? I mean, if you're just thinking about Latter-day Saint culture, and this is mentioned in the documentary, that, you know, as one woman told you, Utah is known as a family-friendly state. It's a core value of the state. And the fact that it finds itself in the center of this really conflicted story about families, separating mothers or coercing them from their babies, those kinds of things. How do you understand that? Is there a faith dimension here? Is there a cultural dimension? What do you think you understand about this, having explored this story?
I believe that the foundational nature of the family and the importance of family among Latter-day Saints really is the overarching framework for the development of the laws. Some may have been intentional or may have been on the books as a result of just simple, well, that's how we've always done it. But one thing that is part of the law that is still encoded is that if you are an unmarried birth father, you virtually have no rights in Utah to any say about whether the woman who is carrying your child may go ahead and place that child for adoption. There are very few states that have that written into the code. And what that says to me is, well, the traditions of the LDS Church are that you get married and you have family, and that family is yours forevermore. And I think that cannot help but have shaped what has happened in Utah.
There's another angle to this, and maybe it's not fair to connect it to the church directly, but it involves, and this is a darker part of the story, it involves a Latter-day Saint by the name of Paul Peterson, because you tell this larger history here. And you say in the documentary that for years families would go overseas to adopt children. And you say that, hundreds of thousands of babies were brought to the U.S. And it became really scandalous. It was shut down in the early 2000s. But there's this character that emerges named Paul Peterson, He spends 2 years as a Mormon missionary in the Marshall Islands. And it's when he comes back, and I'm not sure it's the exuberance that he gets as a missionary, his connections that he's made. I'm not sure it's at all connected to his faith. It may be. The fact is he is a returned Mormon missionary who starts this adoption business that is really shady. Tell us a bit about this story, if you would.
So, in the early 2000s, the same social moray changes that affected Utah in the early 2000s began shaping American culture at large in the 1970s. Birth control was available, divorce was acceptable, single women could raise their children by themselves, and the adoption rate plummeted in the United States. So for 30, 40 years, Americans went overseas. Americans who wanted to adopt were able to get their babies abroad. Guatemala, Ethiopia, China, Russia, and Korea. And by the early 2000s, corruption scandals of trafficking women, of coercion, that, women were forced to sign, or they were offered money, or they were being, recruited by middlemen to surrender their children. One by one, those countries shut down their adoption programs for people who lived abroad. And in the late 1990s, this young Mormon missionary, Paul Peterson from Arizona, was doing his mission in the Marshall Islands. And he was observing that, wait a minute, this is an interesting thing. People want babies. The Marshall Islands has a very special and specific relationship with the United States. We conducted nuclear testing in this set of islands, atolls really, in the North Pacific. And we left this nuclear devastation in the wake of this testing. And the Marshallese people began suffering disproportionately from all different kinds of cancers, and they came to the U.S. government 30 years after the fact, in the early 80s, maybe 25 years after the initial bombings, and said, we want reparations. And the U.S. government thought that was a big can of worms and decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to offer you that. But we will offer you something else. We will allow you to come to the United States without a visa. We're going to issue a compact of free association that allows all Marshallese people to be able to come visa-free, no questions asked, to the United States. They can work, they can live, they can go to school, they can live as Americans. So Peterson knew this. Peterson was aware of that one big loophole. You have this market that's cratering. By the time he was finished with his mission, went back to Arizona, undergrad, went to law school in Arizona, became a lawyer. I think he was doing bankruptcy law. He didn't find it fulfilling. And as an LDS guy, he thought, okay, I can help people create families. So that's exactly what he did. There was the one loophole, obviously, of the Marshallese people who are allowed to come, no questions asked. And secondarily, there is a cultural aspect to the Marshallese. It's a clan-based system. They have a very open, very beautiful culture in which children themselves are deeply precious, as they are in all cultures. But let's say I have 6 girls and my brother has 6 boys. And I love my brother so much. I want to give him one of my girls to show him how much I cherish his being on the planet. I want to give him a baby. And he loves me so much. He and his wife give me a boy. And there isn't even a word in Marshallese culture for this transaction. It's just how things are done. And it's very common. There isn't a word for adoption. There isn't a word for your uncle who's your father, who's really your uncle. This doesn't exist. And he also exploited that. I don't know how many people he baptized. In the Marshall Islands, they called him this big, tall guy, blonde, called him Big Papa. And he recruited even some of the people he had converted as pregnant women to come to the United States. He offered them money, and he promised them that they would have ongoing relationships with their adoptive families. And he was choosing the adoptive families for them. And he promised the women, oh, you're going to become a larger part of this family. You are going to be able to live the American dream. You and your baby are going to be a part of this concept that doesn't even have words in Marshallese. I mean, it probably does, but I don't speak Marshallese, so I don't know what they are. But the family sharing that I just described, he promised to these women in addition to cash. And it was so lucrative, and he was so successful in Arizona in the early 2000s. As the international adoption market was cratering, he then expanded to Utah and also to Arkansas, which is where the greatest diaspora of Marshallese people is. They work in their very low-level jobs, most of them, in poultry factories, poultry processing plants. They don't speak English. They don't have a high level of education, and they're very poor. And he used 4 loopholes. One, it's not a loophole, but it was his advantage. He spoke fluent Marshallese. 2, he understood the culture and promised these women this ongoing contact, ongoing embrace inside their American families. He promised money to people in a set of islands where I think the average wage today in 2026, we just looked this up, was something like between $7,000 and $9,000. And he offered them straight up cash, $3,000. It's a lot of money if you don't have any. And he also very swiftly understood the laws, the porous laws of various states, and Utah was one of them.
Well, we should mention that, as you report, he pleads guilty to a number of these charges against him, state and federal charges, including human smuggling. I guess he's now in prison, sentenced to 10 years.
He is. He's serving a combined sentence. But the interesting thing is that a series of events occurred in order to report him. One was a family in Santaquin who had adopted through him and didn't like the feel of how they had adopted. And they had this beautiful little baby boy, and they wanted to have an ongoing relationship, which they do to this day, with their baby's birth mother. They realized that things just didn't look or sit right with them. And they ultimately became whistleblowers to the state for what they witnessed.
This brings us to a really powerful scene in the film, and I wanted you to set this up for us. This is about a family, Dan and Rachel Christensen. They hire Paul Peterson. This was a few years ago, 2018, to help them adopt a baby. And what happens to them is kind of gut-wrenching. And would you just take us through this scene in the film?
Yes. So this couple hires Paul Peterson, as you said, and they're almost immediately matched with a birth mother. They had thought that it would take a couple of years maybe, and this is just a couple of weeks, months later, they get an email late at night that says, you've been matched. You've been matched, and we need you to wire this money. Here's our bank account. Here's my bank account number, and here's the birth mother. They're very excited, and they proceed. They meet this birth mother a couple of days later, and it turns out that she's had no prenatal care. And it's freezing. It's February. It's snowing outside. And she's in flip-flops and a dress. And they're asking themselves questions like, this is strange. The woman, her name is Thelma. She asks Rachel Christensen, the prospective adoptive mother, to go with her to an obstetrician appointment. The obstetrician says, Thelma's placenta is completely calcified. If we don't take this baby, he's going to be stillborn. Telma's induced the next day, and this couple in Santaquin immediately has this new baby and the set of circumstances that are perplexing in the extreme. The baby had to stay a couple of extra days in the hospital. They decided that once he was released, they wanted to go by and show the baby to Telma, the birth mother. So they are completely committed to having an open, ongoing, loving relationship with their son's mother. They're honoring this commitment, this promise. Wouldn't dream of doing it any other way. They go to the address where she had been staying.
I remember walking in, and there was all these pregnant women, like, sleeping on the floor. I don't know how Dan felt, but I was like, this is like a baby meal. Like,
yeah.
You would have a puppy meal. Like, that's what it felt like. And just being like, what have we done?
It is full of pregnant women from the Marshall Islands. They can't believe their eyes. It kind of gives me chills even to think of that. You're holding this baby you've just brought home from the hospital. All this has happened so quickly. And you see this scene that begs description. And they turned to an investigator with the state of Utah at the Attorney General's office, who had already received tips from nurses and social workers at a variety of different hospitals who were equally mystified by what it was that was going on. So the people on the ground who were risking so much, their jobs, they were speaking up to authority, they were speaking out about the creation of something sacred, a family. And here were these clients of Peterson himself who said this didn't feel right. We couldn't live with ourselves if we didn't report. But they were very concerned. Would it then dissolve this family that they had just created?
Yeah. The investigation leads to charges for Peterson. He's now serving time. Do you want to say something about where he's ended up?
Yes. The Utah Attorney General's office was also working with the Arizona authorities as well as federal officials in Arkansas. And it was a highly unusual mix of state and federal investigators. And ultimately, he was charged with federal charges, and in Arizona and Utah with state charges and federal charges in Arkansas. And he served several years in Texas in federal prison and is now in a lower security facility in his home state of Arizona. But the total amount of time is supposed to be roughly 10 years.
Gabrielle Glaser, we're talking about the Frontline documentary Baby Brokers. It's free to watch. We'll put a link to it on our website, RadioWest.org. We'll take another break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with the journalist Gabrielle Glaser. We're talking about the story she reported for the PBS program Frontline. It's about the adopted baby tourism industry in the U.S. It's called Baby Brokers. I want to ask you about what's happening in Utah. Let's bring it back to the Utah legislature. Lawmakers have started to address some of these questions, but really only recently. They started last summer to really get down to some of these questions, as we've already talked about in March. They did consider these laws that would give mothers 72 hours. They passed these laws that would give mothers 72 hours to revoke consent. Also, that would require all these agencies to be registered as nonprofits, disclosure, those kinds of things. And they passed them. What do you make of what they did? lawmakers. It fixed some of it, but it seems like there are still some open questions here.
Well, yes, the coverage of the things that had been going on, the adoption tourism that had been happening in Utah for the last several years, reached the state legislature. And in particular, a woman who is a Republican state legislator named Katie Hall, who was also a nurse and a former she works in surgery now, but she was a former labor and delivery nurse. The news of some of this happening, this tourism, this turnover in hospitals, reached this legislator, Katie Hall. And there are a couple of practitioners who run for-profit agencies. One is Denise Garza, we mentioned her earlier, and another one is a woman named Sandy Quick, who worked in the adoption business for about a quarter century, a little more than a quarter century. The volume of some of adoptions in a handful of hospitals north of Salt Lake was so striking. Most of them were being facilitated by these two Utah practitioners, Sandy Quick, again, she ran an agency called Brighter Adoptions, and Denise Garza, who runs an agency called Love and Light. Her license had been suspended by the state. In 2018, she lost her license for 5 years, but she was allowed to return to practice under a different name. At some point in 2024, this began reaching a critical mass. There were some stories. I had written a national story for New York Magazine that took a look at this. There were local reporters on the ground who did a terrific job, one at the Trib and another one at Fox, who were reporting really relentlessly on this. And finally, it reached a critical mass where, combined with this striking volume of adoptions and out-of-state adoptions, one hospital, there was a social worker who told us in the reporting that typically her hospital would see something like 3 to 5 adoptions, maybe 6 adoptions a year. She was seeing 3 to 5 a week, all out of state, all facilitated by Quick and Garza. She then told, she was a constituent of Hall's. Hall's went to the legislature, and the legislature held a handful of hearings on this phenomenon of adoption tourism. The first was in June. There was another one in August. There was a following one in October. I believe another one in November. And finally, a vote in March of 2026 that said, no, this is... There were problems about... I'd never heard this. I've covered a lot of different things in my life, but there were deep concerns for Utah's reputation. There was a reputational image that seemed to be concerning for a number of lawmakers. And it was quite thoughtful. There were deliberations for months, as you know, but it made it, boom, through the Senate and through the House and was signed by the governor in March. There were a series of reforms that were issued. One now gives a revocation period for women once they sign of 72 hours. There is now a cap on the amount of money an agency is allowed to offer a woman, and that total is $8,000, which is still exponentially higher than an agency is able to offer a woman in Connecticut. Still a lot of money. And another one of the reforms is that all agencies must be nonprofit, must convert to nonprofit status. I don't remember what the time frame is, but I believe by next year sometime.
One of the things that complicates the story is that you have this complex web of laws. As you sort of point out to someone you were interviewing, there's 50 different states and 50 different sets of laws. So I'm wondering, who's trying to fix that? Because I do know you mentioned in the film that some states are backing this federal adoption bill. Is there a sense of trying to tie all of this together into one coherent law?
Yes, some advocates worked very, very, very hard on drafting legislation that entered the House and the Senate. It was introduced as a bipartisan bill in both houses of Congress in November. It's something called the Adopt Act, and it is aimed at banning and getting rid of these internet intermediaries entirely. So both the brokers who get a recruitment fee for targeting vulnerable women, and secondarily, the consultants who work with adoptive parents to try to steer them to states that have the loosest laws. It will require people to be licensed. If you advertise adoption services in a certain state, you must be licensed in that state. And if that means you have a post office box in that state and you have a shingle out somehow, that's okay. But at least you are abiding. If you advertise in that state, you must be abiding by the laws of that state if you are offering adoption services.
Let me ask you finally, are you optimistic about that? And where do you think this story is headed now? What do you see? How is this playing out?
Well, I will say that at last count, there were, when we started the reporting, I believe there were maybe a half dozen, 5 or 6 co-sponsors of the bill. Then there were 9, and now there are 20. And again, they're on both sides of the aisle and in both the Senate and the House. So that is quite remarkable. And I take that as a hopeful sign. One of the co-sponsors of the bill is incredibly liberal, Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, and another is Katie Britt of Alabama, who's very, very conservative. And I spoke to a Republican from Florida who was incredibly well-versed in the matter and very outspoken about the need to protect families who are vulnerable on both sides. I was very impressed, and I think that's a helpful, hopeful sign. That said, there has been legislation introduced in the U.S. Congress since 1955. In the wake of the Georgia Tan scandal, the woman I mentioned, the social worker who began the commodification of adoption, in the wake of her death, there was a gigantic nationwide investigation. And a Tennessee senator introduced a bill that would ban the sale of a child, federal ban on the sale of a child, and it didn't make it out of committee. And there has been one introduction of similar bills ever since by Republicans and Democrats, ranging from Hillary Clinton to a very, very, very conservative former senator from Mississippi. And nobody ever bites. So this has momentum. It seems maybe more, but you even that, you think, oh my goodness, wait, what? There's no federal ban on the sale of a child? The ingredients you have on the back of a bottle of sunscreen are regulated to an inch of their lives, and we don't have a ban on baby selling? It seems pretty wild. One of our producers at Frontline, when we were introducing this story to him, he said, wow, what's criminal is that so much of this is legal.
Gabrielle Glaser, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Our time.
Gabrielle Glaser. Her documentary for the PBS program Frontline is called Baby Brokers. You can watch it for free on PBS. We'll put a link to it on our website, RadioWest.org. Her book is American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Secret History of Adoption. We should mention KUER reporter Hugo Rickard-Bell has been following this story. We'll also share a link to his coverage on the website. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Instagram at Radio West. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. You can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Aidan Oneida. The program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. I'm Doug Fabrizio.